Greetings hobbyists, this is Arslanzavul, and in this tutorial we're going to have a look at some hotkeys and some top tips for using Boxcutter. So we started looking at Boxcutter in our last tutorial, and we were having a look at this top bar here and what all the functions do. Now watching that definitely isn't required for you to understand what we're going to go through in this tutorial, but if you haven't used Boxcutter before, it might be worth a look, and even if you have, it might be worth a look anyway, just to find out some new things about those options. So if you want to do that, there is a link in the top right hand corner and in the description. Now other than the key, if I go out of Boxcutter of Alt and W to get into Boxcutter and it's W to get out of Boxcutter, we didn't really look at many hotkeys in the last tutorial, as there was a lot of other things to focus on. Now until you learn them, which does take some practice, there are a few places where you can access these hotkeys. The first is when you start drawing any object. For example, I'm in box mode. You'll see on the bottom of the screen, you get a lot of information about hotkeys that you could use. For example, G to move the shape around, and they're really useful just to give you some ideas. But they focus on the ones that are most typically being used by people, and they definitely don't include all of them. So if I escape out of that, which will cancel drawing this object, if I press N and bring out the N tab, we've got, when we go down to here, the Boxcutter menu, and that has lots of things on it, but at the top it's got some information about the hotkeys that are relevant at the current point. So as soon as I start drawing things, you'll notice that they change quite a lot. And if I just take my mouse over here, I can still scroll up and down these to look at those options and then come back to my main viewer and then move around the object. So this is really useful to have a look through, though I will say that these still don't go through every single option. There are a few I'm going to refer to through this tutorial that actually aren't available there. So I'm going to close this menu for this just because I don't like having my M panel open all the time. But before I do, there is one option that I'd really recommend ticking over here, though you can also do this with a hotkey. And that is, if you, like me, like using Madcap for your view, which turns the object red as opposed to the standard studio or even the standard matcap, which is grey. This is fairly easy to see when you're cutting in this, so perfectly usable. However, I prefer my red matcap, and that makes this cutter, especially the red one for cut, quite difficult to see. So to solve that, if you come down to the Boxcutter options, come all the way down to where it says behavior, I find it quite useful to click this show wire option, and what that will mean is when you draw your object, it gains these nice clear green wires for what you're doing, and this is really useful for doing things like counting bevel lines and things like that. It just gives you a clearer view of what you're doing, and while some people don't need that, especially for CG work, if we're going to be 3D printing, it's really useful to see exactly what's going to happen and where those minor lines are going to be. So I'm going to press N to hide that panel, and we're going to start going through some of these options. Now I'm going to try and go through these in relatively logical order, so I'm going to start with, if I'm going to be drawing some object, for example a box, what we might want to use straight away. So the first hotkey that we covered in our last tutorial is when we've got snapping on. If we put our mouse over a face and press Control, we get these control points which are going to be located in each corner of the face, and then dots in the center of each of the edges and one in the center. Now, the other option is that when we press G, this is going to bring up a grid, which is obviously going to be really useful. It means that we don't have to go up here and toggle it on and off. So I'll generally keep snapping turned on, so I have that option with Control, and if I want to use a grid, I can just press the grid. Now, what we will notice is that this being 10 wide, obviously we've got 10 boxes wide, but being 5 tall, we've got our 1, 2, and a half from the center. And in the last tutorial, I had a look at how we can move the origin so that we have the grid and we're not getting half points between. And obviously we could change our grid size to being 0.5 meter. If I set the grid on, change this to 0.5 meter, and I can still turn that off and have this as an option. But there is another option with this if I just escape out of it. If I press Control, if instead of moving the origin around, if I move my mouse over to one of the corners or one of the top center options and press G, you'll see that it now centers the grid over that point. So we've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as our thickness. So there's a lot of ways of manipulating this grid that's really easy just using the Control and G button. So that's the first thing that's worth noting. Now I'm going to keep this grid up. In fact, I'm going to press Control and G to have it in the center to make the next bit really easy to see. And that is that if I start drawing my box, for example here, and it's snapping, if I press the Alt button, that's going to change how this is being drawn. So with boxes as standard, it draws from that point. So where we clicked to begin with, which was the center, becomes one of the corners. Whereas if I press Alt, it becomes the center. which means that we've got this option for centering this compared to where we started it. And obviously we're snapping at the moment, so we can go either way. Now with objects, and we're starting cutting now, if I escape, and I press escape again to get rid of the grid, if we're using objects that do the opposite, for example, if I change this over to a circle, press Control to get the center, and start drawing, this automatically uses the first click as the center, and then if we press Shift, it's going to do the opposite, where we're going to have the corner, or where we first clicked as the corner of the sphere. I don't know why they don't just have that as Alt, but Alt actually does something else for a circle here, so we'll have a quick look at that. So if I just draw and press Alt, this will actually deform this circle so we don't get a perfect circle. Whereas if I use a box and come back into this and start drawing, what Shift does is draws it as a perfect box. I don't know why they've got these the opposite way round. It would make sense for Shift to constantly choose whether the option's perfect and Alt to permanently choose if it's the center or not. I don't know why they do that different for the two objects. I would say that's a slight oversight on their part. Maybe it'll be something that's changed in the future. So they're really useful as we get to change things on the fly without having to go to this top box. Now the next option is really useful, and it's probably the one I use the most. I'll also say, while I'm working on quite a powerful computer, I found that this was really good on slower computers, as they often can't cope with me being able to move this around while panning around as well. Whereas if when we started drawing we press the tab button, what that does is that locks my shape in place. So now I'm not worried about doing anything, but it hasn't confirmed it yet. So I can still use all the modifiers that I would normally use, it just holds it in place. Now obviously that's a bit annoying because we've now got the back locked in, and if I move around I might decide I want to change that, but if you just press E, that allows us to continue to change the amount of extrusion that has gone on. So for example, I could make that less deep, click, and now I can still move around because I'm locked into this cut, but it hasn't been confirmed yet. So once we've done this, we can do all our standard maneuvers. So for example, I could press S to scale this, though do note and notice at this point it's not actually creating a cut in, it would be in the center, which is a problem because it scales on all axes, but I can just press what axis I want it to be on. So I could just press Y, and now it's just scaling on the Y, X just scale on the X, Z will come in and out, and you'll notice that these scales aren't quite right in terms of the gimbal, they are right in comparison to where the object's been drawn. So I quite often just fiddle around with these until I find the one that I want. We can also press G to move the object around, and we can press R to rotate it if we want. I'm going to press escape to confirm that. Now if I just come out of that and draw this object again, and again press tab to confirm it, the other one that's really worth knowing for rotating is that Control and R, if I do that now, will rotate this object a full 90 degrees, so you've got that to be nice and perfect if you need or decide that you need to rotate it by 90 degrees for any reason. So the next one that's quite good for modifying objects or making them look a little bit more interesting is the bevel option, and that is just B. That will bring in this bevel here, and I normally have this set quite high. Again, I'm doing this for 3D modeling. If you're doing this for CG, you're probably going to have the amount of edges on this or the amount of vertices on your bevel relatively low. But for 3D printing, we want that quite high, as otherwise we're going to have very visible edges on this. But sometimes you'll only want something like a chamfer, which is a one-sided bevel, and scrolling all the way down, because you can change this by scrolling all the way down to 1, and then sometimes back up to all the way 10 is really annoying, and they've actually nicely thought about that. If I scroll all the way to the edge and then come back, it changes it to a chamfer, and again if I go to the edge and back, it comes back to the bevel. So a really useful tool to flip between them depending on what you want. I'm going to click that to confirm it. Now obviously when this is done, we can click B to come back into this and again change it, as long as we haven't confirmed this by clicking or hitting enter. Now once we've got the bevel activated, and it does have to be done while the bevel is activated, we can also press the Q button, and that puts a bevel on the back wall as well. So we've either got it just on the sides or also on the back wall, and the bevel on those will be exactly the same. Now there is a way to change this so that you have the bevels different for the one that's at the back wall and the one that's on the corner, which is a really nice touch. I'm going to have a look at that later when we start talking about some other options and things we can do, so stay tuned for that one. The other thing we can do with this Q bevel is that if we press Shift and F, this is going to flip where this back bevel is onto the front wall and bevel it out. So we get this, if I click, this really nice, smooth, beveled off shape. And this is especially useful when we can start modifying the different bevels. I will say at the moment it does seem to be limited to the fact that we cannot bevel both the inside, or sorry, I should say the back face and the front face. The next one that I want to talk to, I'm probably going to use the circle for, because I think it's quite nice. And actually, let's make sure that's nice in the center and put that back. And again, we're going to press tab so that we've got that locked in. And that is the V button. So what V does is it creates an array. And I can just use my scroll wheel to control how many of these I have. For example, 2 or 3, something like that. The other thing that I can do is, if I press V again, it'll change this to a radial array. So again, I've got 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7, and so on. So I can keep using the V to scroll through from radial array to no array to a straight array, and I can change the direction of this. Obviously this is currently in one axis. If I just press X, it will change between those two. So I can do this in whatever axis I would like, really nice, quickly and easily. So that's V. And once we've got that far, we can keep using all of our other ones. So I can click that in, B to bevel, and then Shift F and double click. And I've got something really nice, really quickly, and I know that that is very much centered on the circle. And if I want to, I can always press, if you've got hard ops as well, Q to ever scroll back into that, click on it, and I can just press R to rotate that around to get it whatever way I would like it to be, and I can still scale it. So lots of options there that are really quick to activate and sort out. Obviously this does or has made the shading look a little bit rubbish here, but that's very easy to fix. Once we confirm the boolean of the cut, we can just move around our different connection points. Let's get rid of that again. So next one, and I'm going to come back to my box, is the Thicken Modifier. Now this has two different functions to it depending on what we're using. So I'll start with the most simple, and that is if I draw this box, again I'm going to tab to lock this in, and if I press the thicken function, which is T, and you can see that this is one of the ones at the bottom, we call this solidify. I always think of it as thickening, whichever one's easier for you. If I press T, you'll notice that what that's doing is that is turning the edge of the box into a thickened feature, which means that we get this internal box and this external one. Do note that this is thickening it on all sides, so these are not connected at this point. It's going to leave something that's effectively hollow, and then the box in the middle of it. Now if I go back to my thickening, one really nice feature of this is at the moment we've got our internal face staying the same and we're thickening the outside. So it is only, in this instance solidify, applying a solidify modifier to the outside of this edge. Now if you press 2, what it will do is it will do these equally from where the original line was of our cube or box that we were cutting in, and if I press 3, it will turn the outside to be fixed in shape and it will just move the internal one. Now I should mention that being that these are all modifiers, if I confirm this by hitting enter and use Q and ever scroll again and select this, you'll notice that as soon as I've selected the cutter, this solidify modifier is still there. So I can do anything I want to change it. For example, I can fill around with the thickness and give that an exact amount. For example, 0.5 meters. So that's all still there as an option. Now if instead of using the cut modifier we're using an inset modifier, this now does something different. So if I draw my box here and move through, once I press tab and lock this in, the thickness mode here doesn't do what it would normally do on a cube. Instead it affects how much of an inset we've got. So if I press T, I can make a relatively thin inset, or I can make a very deep inset, something like that. Now obviously this is different to the other modifier of using T for solidify, as this is going to make one solid object, not having this internal cube being different. I'm just going to move that back to being the cut. Now one thing you'll notice here is if I do this box, push it in, tab, B to bevel it, you'll notice that here this has saved the idea that when I use bevel it's going to have the bevel on the back face, so I need to press Q to undo that. And once I click on that and double click to confirm it, to do anything with this, to do anything with the cutter, with hard ops, and I know this isn't really hard but it is something that's a bit tedious, Q, ever scroll, select it, now I've got the bevel here. You don't always have to do this in this way if instead I draw the object, tab to lock it in, B to bevel it, and if I press the L button, you'll notice this turns this sort of bluey colour. That has made this cutter live, and there's no difference to this. The only thing that is different here is that when I confirm this, you'll see that the cutter, I'll turn off my face orientation here because it's showing like there's errors when there's not. My cutter is now still here, so I can just click to select it. I didn't have to use ever scroll. So that is the L button to make the cutter live. Now that is something that is a persistent feature, so as soon as I start drawing again, you'll notice straight away it's got that blue outline and it is going to be live. All I do is press L again if I don't want that to happen. Now the next hotkey, if I get to my thickness and tab, is to use the taper function. Now obviously T is taken up with this thicken or solidify, so we have to press Shift and T to do this, and all that will do is this is going to taper the back face there, so we've got this equal taper on all sides. Now this has obviously got a lot of functionality to it in what you're wanting to do in terms of making shapes, but for me, again for 3D modelling, the most promising bit of this is very useful if you're going to be trying to make keyed in parts of a different shape, because it means that you've got this nice tapered inset where you're going to put the different parts of the model into each other. So that taper feature is really handy for breaking apart the models. Now the last one of the true hotkeys in terms of affecting the cut itself is the wedge cut. So again, if I make a box, start pushing that in, if I press W, we get this wedge, which is really nice, and if I press W again, it will change the side the wedge is on. Now, one limitation of this is if I press wedge again, it's going to go back to there being no wedge, and again, if I press it again, it's from the top, then from the left, then back to nothing, and you'll notice there's no option to do the right and the bottom. Now, the reason for this is that whatever direction you pull or drag your mouse from, whatever corner that was in, that's the one that's going to have the wedge option. So, for example, when I did it last, I pulled from the top left, dragged down, and that means my wedge is from the top or the left, or not at all. If I do the opposite and drag from the bottom right, now my wedge will be from the right or the bottom, or none. So the angle you've clicked there is going to be really important for determining what you can do with that wedge. Now the other thing with a wedge that's really worth mentioning is that if I start making our wedge and press W, you'll notice that obviously this affects how far in and out I go. If you press Control, this wedge becomes perfectly halfway between the face angles. And what I mean by that is instead of being 90 degrees, it's going to be half that, which is 45 degrees. And that I personally find is a really nice option to be able to have, that you can do that and you'll know that will be exactly 45 degrees. Now the last two bits with hotkeys, if I just escape out of this, is when we're in this mode, we haven't started cutting yet. If I press D, we get this really big helper box, which essentially has got all the options on the top here and a few additional ones. Now what's nice about this helper menu is that if I start creating an object and press it here, it's now totally changed. It's got all my options. For example, I can change what type of cut I'm doing. Obviously, I can do that with hotkeys. They're all down the bottom here. So for example, say I wanted a slice, I'd just press X. If I wanted an inset, I'd press I. So for example, I can do that nice and easily. Now I've got an inset. If I want it to become a cut again, I'll press X. It just tells me them at the bottom. That's why this bottom bit is so helpful. But if I press D, I can obviously see a nice visual representation of those. I can also change the view that I'm doing it from. Obviously, that's not going to make a difference for this object. It's just going to be in the future. It also gives me the option to always be using the grid, so I can affect that up there. But importantly, I can add in a wedge straight away. I can add in a taper, and straight away it will do it. I can add in a bevel, or it just tells me what the option is. For example, I can press B and add that bevel here. The other thing that's really useful about this is that if I do this again, D, you'll notice here, and we talked about this earlier, I've got my bevel on my main object and then I've got a bevel on the back face. And if I press D, you'll see I have now the details of that. I've got my main bevel here. It's got 10 faces, and at the moment it is 0.3 something meters in radius, so I can now change that to be exactly 0.5. And for my second bevel, say I didn't want this to be a full bevel or to have 10 faces to it, I can just press D and change that to, let's say, 1. So now I've got a chamfer on the back face, and with this button I can do the flip. So now I've got my chamfer on the outside, but my multi-edged bevel on the inside. And that allows you to make some really, really nice industrial looking shapes, or potentially quite sci-fi looking shapes for these cut insets. And obviously this is really so much quicker than if you were doing this trying to use booleans and separate objects. I mean, this would be a massive pain. And importantly, normally to do this bevel on the outside of this edge or this chamfer, you would have to confirm the boolean cut of the other object before you could do this. Whereas in Boxcutter we can do this, and this still hasn't been confirmed. I can still turn this off and on as I want. I can still press Q and ever scroll and go to it, and press G and confine that to the Y axis or something, or just make sure that it doesn't move on the X axis so I can move this around. You get so many more options with Boxcutter that allow you to play with your design without confirming it, so you can come back and change it later. Now the last hotkey, which gives you again a lot more options, is if I start drawing my object and tab to lock that in, is if I press Alt and D, we get these dots appearing. And these dots are fantastic. Firstly, we've got a dot on the back wall, so I can move this in and out. Obviously, we can do this with E as well. We're just doing an extrusion, but it's quite nice to have a visual representation of this. We've also got this one at the bottom here, and you'll notice this is in grey. And if I do that, that's going to allow me to move the object a little bit more freely for both of those. And we've got this one in blue here, and that one is going to instantly activate a bevel. Now, we can just do that again with those shortcuts, but it is useful to have that as an option. Now, the other thing that this does, which is not an option, is that it actually brings up the corners of our cutter. So I can start moving this around, and that gives a lot of options. And while it's useful in a box, I mean, it's fine. But especially if we're going to use the N-gon, and we're doing a cut something like this, don't know, just making something up here really quickly, just for demonstration purposes, and I tab that, you'll see that this now has given me a point at each one of these corners. And obviously, I can click on one of those and move it around as much as I want. You'll notice this is still snapping two different angles, or I can press Control to have total freedom over this. And I can still bevel these as much as I want, either as a 10-sided bevel, and I can use my mouse to move that up and down, or as a chamfer. Now, I will say I literally just discovered this by misclicking something and was going to edit it out, but this is just so good. If you go over one of the corners, and instead of pressing your left mouse button to move it around, you press your middle mouse button, you can bevel just one of those, or you can bevel each one a different amount. That's kind of blown my mind. I literally, until 10 seconds ago, didn't know that was a thing. I'm just going to see how much that affects it if I do. Oh, that affects all of them equally if I do that with then this dot, and I can just come back in and go to nothing. Yeah, that's awesome. Really happy about that. Just gonna quickly check if I can do that with a box as well. Yeah, that will do that with just one for the box. So yeah, there we go. Learn something new every day, even when you're doing tutorials. If you go over one of the corners, one of the blue corners, and you hold down the middle mouse button instead of your normal left mouse button to click, you will be able to bevel just one of them. And I wonder how, yeah, and once you've got that held down, as long as you keep holding down while you're scrolling, you can change the amount of faces on this, though it does look like it affects all of them. Interestingly, I wonder if I press D here, yeah, you'll notice that this has got a main bevel here, which has got 14, and you've got this second bevel, which is the back wall. That's quite interesting there, and that one seems to be affecting both the same, though obviously if I go to this one and make that really small and press D, then it's saying it for the biggest one, and I can move that and it will affect both, but this is only for the biggest one, it looks like. I don't know for certain, I've literally just found that out. On one last shortcut, which I just used really quickly, sorry, I got probably a bit carried away there, is that if you press, instead of D to get the helper box menu, you press Control and D, you get this menu here, which again is just a simplified version of this. It has all the options there of, for example, where your origin is going to be, things like that. So that's really useful to be able to play around with, just as something to quickly... I normally use this just as a quick way of changing from, say, I'm in box to circle, because it stops me having to go all the way up to there, though you can just equally do it on the side here. It's just another option. Some people prefer this pie menu than others. As always, I hope you found this really useful, and if you found something that you didn't know about previously, even if maybe you're quite experienced at Boxcutter, please do add a comment to this. It's really nice to hear from people and see what they've found out from these tutorials. And in the next tutorial, we're going to be creating a design using mostly Boxcutter to show how I would use this in a workflow to create a relatively detailed mesh. If you want to watch that and you haven't subscribed, please do click the subscribe button and the bell so that you are made aware of when I post new content.